School of Economics and Political Science. Eileen Barker's been interested in this phenomenon of cults for many years, and I'm going to write to her. She's probably already done this. And you see, Brexit follows all the criteria of what cults are. They have charismatic leaders. They put forward a specific ideology. You're not allowed to deviate or question that ideology. Your family is pressured into believing it. They also have an apocalyptic view that everyone outside the cult is in the grip of the devil. And they also have a sort of Armageddon time ticking away, that it's urgent that we promote this ideology now because it's the only path. It has all the hallmarks of quite a dangerous cult that's literally overswept the nation. It's a kind of psychic implanting. And I've tried as an intellectual historian to trace its origins to Steve Bannon and some of the occultists behind him. And I think it's a deliberate case of manufacture in some of the obscure byways of Oxford and places where Hannon and others have come from. It has a lineage going back to extreme Protestantism. Michael Gove represents that. And it's one of the features of cults is that they're very anti the Catholic tradition. They're anti-universalism because you have to attack Catholicism in order to justify your own truth. And so Brexiteers have done a deal with hard-right Protestantism in Ireland and in America and in the UK in general, because they're arguing that the EU is the product of Catholic hegemony, and therefore must be opposed by all righteous and good Protestants. I find this a lamentable argument. I think that the tradition of anti-Catholicism in England, I thought it being put to bed. I was brought up in the Anglican tradition, which sees itself as authentically Catholic, but also authentically Protestant, and authentically Orthodox, and authentically Gnostic. It seems to me that Christ's teaching in the church was not let's attack that lot and let's destroy that lot and let's elevate this lot. It was let's find the universal common truths. Or he wouldn't have stressed love as much as he did. I think if we come from a place of love, which is also where St Bridget was coming from, and that's why I was celebrating today with light, then we can't take an anti-Catholic extremist position. I've taken communion in Catholic churches, Protestant, Anglican. I celebrate the wisdom of the Christ spirit in all the manifestations that the truly universal church teaches. And that's actually the Orthodox Anglican position, that the true, Christ is the head of the church. No bishop, no pope, no cardinal is the head of the supernatural church. On this plane, the church appears to be fractured and split, but supernaturally it's a unity. That's what Hegel said in his Christology, and I agree with him as well. So anti-Catholicism it's intellectually puerile, but it has very dangerous consequences. In the 17th century, 18th century, mobs used to roam the streets of London killing Catholics. And if you were Irish, you would be arrested as a papist. The mobs of the English Civil War brought this out in a horrendous way. And papist hunting became a sort of fad. It's one of the reasons the Cavaliers were unfortunately forced to flee to Europe. I think what we have to do as a country in Britain is not revisit these ancient civil wars. I propose to the syndics of the University of Oxford Press that we should publish a encyclopedia of the history of the civil wars of Britain and Ireland to commemorate the 400th anniversary of their closure. Unfortunately, that project is still in abeyance because there's never been a historical dictionary of the civil wars of Britain, unlike many for the American Civil War. And we're seeing, actually, it's rebirthing here, which is shocking. I'm speaking, as a latter-day Herbert of Cherbury saying, hang on, countrymen, let's make peace here. Brexit is going to bring all that stuff out of the woodwork, and we're going to see bombs, as we're beginning to see on the streets of Belfast. We cannot afford to go down that route, and I appeal to all people of moderate, intelligent, common sense to stand up for a second referendum, an ending of this Brexit nightmare. And somehow this extreme right-wing Tory cabal that have hijacked the mind of the Prime Minister have to be, detoxicated. they have to go back to do their homework. Then we have Dominic Grieve. There's a strange paradox here in that he's a Roman Catholic, an extreme Roman. Sorry, not Dominic Grieve. The extreme Tory who's called the Minister for the 17th century, whose father worked for the Times. His name escapes me, but you know the chap I mean. He's a Roman Catholic, and yet he's an extremist Brexiteer. So what on earth is going on in his conscience is a mystery to me. It's probably why I can't remember his name. I find it shocking that someone with presumably a reasonably broad education should end up as in this camp of anti-European fanatics. So I'd appeal to the people that supposedly had a good education. Boris Johnson went to Eton and so on and so on. They really have to remember their fundamental ethics, which is that you go for unity as opposed to disunity. You go for love as opposed for destruction. And you emphasize ontology, being, instead of non-being and destruction. That's the path of violence and hatred. And that's where Brexit is coming from. I'm sorry, at the end of the day, you have to analyse it down. And that's what's going on here. So, no revival of these kind of anti-papist sentiments that these Brexiteers are pushing forward. We need a universal meta-Catholic metaphysic, which is what St Bridget stands for, and also all the great saints of English, Irish, Scottish and Welsh history. St Columba from Iona, St Chad from Mercia, and St David from Wales. They belong to this tradition, which we would call it universal seekers of universal truth. And I would say that all the churches of Britain and Ireland represent people that are working in that spirit. We mustn't give up hope. We mustn't let the light appear to be dimmed. What I find shocking is the way that Theresa May, who has no serious religious studies knowledge, I can tell when I met her, she has no depth to her knowledge here. Although her father was a vicar, it's obviously not come down to her, because her actions are breaking up the United Kingdom, which is a sacred gift, fought for and struggled for by many, many generations of deeply spiritual, caring people. She's throwing it away because it's a whim of her own conceit. And her husband obviously is enticing her in that path. And it's shocking, theologically. And I recommend she should resign as Prime Minister immediately and go on a very long retreat onto the Isle of Iona and spend about 6 months meditating on what she's done. Commune with the spirit of John Smith, who was a very great Labour leader who's buried on the island. I've been to his grave. I'm also speaking as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, which is a job that was given to me, and I've chaired several meetings in the Republic of Ireland, in Belfast, in Dublin, in Wales, in Holyhead, and in Salisbury most recently, and trying to look at how to solve this problem of still getting justice for the victims of the first time of troubles. What we certainly don't want is a repeat of those times of troubles. We don't want the IRA or the Provisional IRA to have an excuse to begin a bombing campaign again. They declared a ceasefire. We've had a decade or two of peace in which the political process took over the street fighting. And there's no way in a million years we can afford to allow that those elements that are still there to think look, you can't trust Albion, perfidious Albion. The only way is military victory here, lads. Back on the streets. And likewise, we can't afford to let the extreme Protestant Ulster, so-called loyalists, but they're being only loyal to their own egos and their fantasy, UK, that their actions are actually breaking up. Now, at the moment, if I was a genuine Ulster Protestant, I would be saying to these people, how dare you misuse the name of unionism to pursue a course of action, Brexit, that is going to destroy the union. I mean, these people don't deserve the title of unionists. They're disunionists. By supporting this cult, which is what Brexit is, according to my scientific analysis, by supporting this cult, they're breaking up the UK. Now, that's a disunionist. So any genuine Ulster Protestant looking at the situation would reel in horror, and most of them have. They've joined the Alliance Party or some more moderate thing. So it's a trap set by ego for its own self-destruction. The Tibetan Buddhists say that Dharmapalas are Dharma protectors. They're the scary, frightening, demonic type things that appear. But actually they're Manjushri in disguise. So I would say that Brexit is one of those scary Dharmapalas, and what it's doing is showing up in stark relief the fact that ego can't work out these problems. Ego has to die and surrender and achieve enlightenment. That was Buddha's wonderful insight. You can't achieve enlightenment and hold on to ego in the other hand. Ulster Protestant, Ulster Catholic, Loyalist, Druid, these are labels, they all have to go. In the fire of divine gnosis, in the encounter with the living truth of love, the labels vanish. The language vanishes, so let's rededicate our lives as a nation to the cultivation of the fire of Bridget, of the goddess of Athena, of wisdom. Not the heresy of cultism, which is what Brexit is, and which shockingly is threatening to destroy our unity. We demand love as a people. And as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland, I will not let Britain and Ireland go down in chaos, whilst I'm still on duty, so to speak. How are we going to get peace? Well, as I've said, it can only come from truth, and that has gradations. Ultimately, truth is just not talking lies, that's just negative truth. But there's positive truth, which is trying to say everything to everybody, always, at all levels. That's meta-Catholic truth, which I'm trying to speak from. As a philosopher, it's my duty. It's the truth of loving your neighbour. It's the truth of trying to love God with all your heart, mind and soul, as Christ said when they put him on the spot. What's truth? That's the way he said, which was a quote from the scriptures. And that means sharpening your mind, sharpening your heart, sharpening your actions to try and represent and embody and express that love in action, which is what all of us are supposed to be doing here. That's why we're an embodiment, for God's sake. Now, Parliament isn't doing that. What on earth has happened to Parliament? I used to love Parliament. I've been there many times. I've chaired meetings with Lord Ennell's help in the House of Lords committee rooms, discussing philosophy and metaphysics. I've given talks like this. And I've had learned people from all faiths and all parties and persuasions discussing complex issues of politics back in the 1990s. When I was charged with setting up a National Institute of Peace Studies at the University of London, I said, well, let's take this debate to Parliament. We had some excellent debates. It never occurred to me that now in 2018 we'd see parliamentarians so obviously lying and being bought. And we had the shocking exposure of parliamentarians by the Daily Telegraph a few years ago about claiming fake expenses and it's a gravy train to them. They should all be kicked out. We need a proper parliament of genuinely truth-speaking people. I don't care what party they're in, as long as they speak the truth. We don't have them at the moment. We have ill-educated people who don't deserve to qualify, in my opinion, to sit as parliamentarians. But then, hang on, there's a bit of a history, a backstory about Parliament, that it's done this kind of thing before. In the 1640s, Parliament issued certain declarations against, if you were James Naylor, who was a Quaker visionary and enthusiast, a great philosopher and poet and sage, a friend of George Fox. Parliament thought he'd gone too far with his Quakerism and ordered that a red-hot poker be stuck through his tongue. This was an act passed by the UK Parliament to punish a philosopher and a poet. And that's, Naylor was just an inspired druid, a wandering bard who went into Bristol preaching poetry. And in those days that was regarded as a sin, and he had the red-hot poker treatment. Now, any parliament that can do that and think it's justified is in need of serious reform. The other thing to say is that the founder of Parliament, Simon de Montfort, was the son of the most horrendous of the anti-Cathar crusaders in France. And both father and son were extremely anti-Semitic and anti-intellectual. The Cathars, for whatever you think of them, I don't agree with their extreme dualistic philosophy, but I admired their courage and their intellectual courage, and I think there should have been solutions through debates and conferences and so on. Dominic had it right when he first started and said, no, we need discussions with these great Cathar thinkers. But it all got out of hand, deteriorated into the most horrendous wars, in which war crimes were done, by both sides, actually. And Simon de Montfort was the worst of the Catholic thugs, who tortured and killed Cathars, men and women. When he attacked the village of Bram, he rounded up 100 people and gouged all their eyes out. His troops did it. And he roped them together in a string of 100 men. I'm not sure if there were women there too. And the front one had one eye left so that he could lead the column to the next town and show what the Catholics were going to do to them if they didn't surrender. He was a war criminal, and that's just one of his many crimes. Why did he do it? Because he hated thinking. He hated Cathars who dared to think outside the box, who dared to look at the sun and the moon and the stars, and who had quite a free attitude to sexuality, and they were Gnostics. They wanted wisdom. They couldn't work out why the world's evils could be descended from a good God. They couldn't see that Jesus would endorse all the sufferings and evils of the world. So they said, no, there's something else dodgy going on here. Some kind of fallen spirits are running this world. Well, to be honest, that's kind of how it looks, isn't it? And so, tragically, they were not allowed to develop their thoughts. I would have said, well, give them a university in Montaillou. Let them have their chairs of Catharism and study this thing, and let them work out with the Catholics a common agenda. They're all some kind of a Christian. I think the Gnostic tradition, as Giles Quispel said, has to be reintegrated into the mainstream of European thought. This is why I've done a commentary on the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of St Thomas. They're both Gnostic Gospels. It certainly wasn't worth killing and torturing and maiming over. But Simon de Montfort, who was not an intellectual of any kind, went for them, and he killed them and massacred them. And he did it also to the Jews he could find. He hated the Jews because they tend to be quite intellectual. And his son, Simon de Montfort Jr., absorbed the same stuff. And when he came to Britain, because he was also Earl of Leicester, and started attacking and revolting against the king, he called the first parliament as a democrat, but it was a pseudo-democracy. It's like he really wanted to go for the elites. He wanted to go for the Jews. He wanted to begin anti-Semitic persecutions. And he was creating a sort of fake democracy, parliament, in order to defeat authentic intellectual activity. You see, intellectual activity is not really a democratic process. It should be put at the feet of the people, but to become an authentic intellectual is a difficult, arduous and complex process. Let me give you a metaphor. If I have, a terrible illness and I need surgery, and I go to the hospital, and I don't expect to be on the operating table, and the hospital manager comes in and says, okay lads, let's get all the hospital staff together, the janitors, the cleaners, the electricians, the accountants, the medical doctors, and all that, and we'll have a vote on who's going to do the operation. And we'll do it at random, actually, we'll take lots, really. No, I expect a surgeon who's actually trained for the job and knows how to do it, to do the surgery. And it's the same with everything else. An airplane pilot, I don't expect there to be a democratic vote before we decide who's going to fly the plane. Now, I don't want the stewardess to fly it, thank you very much. She can serve the coffee. I want the guy who's spent 10 years studying to be a pilot to fly it. Well, I think being a politician is as complex and difficult. That's why I'm proposing a politician's license, like a pilot would have, or a medical doctor. You need your qualifications and degrees. So too to be a politician. And I think that what I call mobocracy is what democracy deteriorates into. Aristotle pointed this out, that democracy is fine in theory, but as Pericles said in Athens, it requires a high level of educational attainment for the people to be able to make meaningful votes. Athens had that, and it succeeded because it was a small state, it was a reasonably small assembly. Everybody had the right to turn up, but even then it got some decisions wrong, like the murder of Socrates by democratic vote of the Athenian people, representatives in the Areopagus. Now, I'm with Socrates. No, there are certain intellectual things that groups and mobs cannot work out, and they shouldn't be decided by mobbing, or kind of, Simon de Montfort's type of, let's get everyone together and go for the lowest common denominator and call that truth. No, that's not how truth works. Truth, you see, I'll give you another example of a fatal decision taken by a democracy is the vote to execute Jesus in the Sanhedrin. Charismatic genius of an intellectual, a seer, a rabbi, whatever you want to call him, a druid. And in the Sanhedrin there was a vote, there was a decision. This man is dangerous, he must go. And so there we see the principle of democracy in action, destroying someone who was, let's say, of a different calibre. And then again that was put to the vote under Pilate with the mob outside later. Should I let this guy go? No, the mob shouts, no, let's let Barabbas go and kill that Jesus guy. So I'm very suspicious of extremist democracy. As an intellectual, as a philosopher, I've studied world history for years. Mobs and so-called fake democracies often make terrible decisions. Athens took terrible decisions in their war with Sparta. Like massacring cities if they didn't back you. Being a democrat doesn't mean you're always on the right side of history. And another example of negative action, I think, around misuse of power is the murder of Thomas à Becket, the great saint of the Christian church in Britain. I'm named after him. The Thomas tradition, largely in England, comes from Thomas à Becket. I went to Vézelay last Mary Magdalene Studies Association conference, and we went to where he preached a sermon. He issued a curse against the people that were misadvising Henry II, who were persecuting him. Although he was Archbishop of Canterbury, his lands had been seized. And this is, in a sense, a prefigurement of the whole Brexit crisis, because Thomas was a European intellectual. He was French-speaking. He was of Norman descent. He was a highly educated man at home in both England and Normandy and France. And the mob, the knights around Henry, who then killed him and hacked him down, were the kind of Brexit baying mobs that, they don't like intellectuals. They stand up in Parliament and say, I'm not an intellectual, These are the hatchet men that cut down the Archbishop of Canterbury and think they're doing it for their little queenie, the Prime Minister, who seems to want to be a surrogate queen. I only hope that Queen Elizabeth II reads my letter and stands up to her, because the woman is a cult leader. Now, as from the perspective of Thomas à Becket, then, Brexit is an absolute catastrophe. You know, there was a time when Britain, we had a thing called the Plantagenet Empire. And you could go from the Pyrenees all the way up to York without a passport because it was one kingdom. This village where I'm speaking from, where the European Peace Museum is, was part of the Plantagenet Empire. You can imagine Eleanor of Aquitaine riding down the streets in the 12th century when this village was already flourishing. Its church is that old. And that to me speaks for the unity that is best between Britain and Europe. Thomas of Becket, the idea of the authentic Christian message of love that is represented in Vézelay, because it's a great church of Mary Magdalene. We should suspend Brexit. We should have a second referendum. We should move on to a whole other conversation, which is how can we reach enlightenment together, all the people of Europe? How can we reach the kingdom of love? How can we make Europe an even more beautiful, socially just, wise, scientifically advanced, integrated and truth-loving continent? How can we bring out the best of all the peoples of Europe? How can we find jobs for all the unemployed youth in Europe? Well, I know, create peace projects, get a European Union mediation service going, give them university study courses in peace studies and comparative philosophy and intellectual work, retrain them as the peace workers of the future. That's the unemployed youth of Europe need to be doing that, and also learning the kind of agricultural and practical skills, trade skills and craft skills. There's so much to be done in this continent, throughout Britain as well. The unemployed people of the Midlands and large parts of Britain. Again, ultimately our job is to master wisdom and love, and I think the European Union can serve as a structure in which we can do that, because we can all travel around to each other's countries, we can learn from each other. You know, I've visited many countries in Europe, and I love them all. I've sat in Italy and Greece, in tavernas by the sea. I've been to Spain, Scandinavia, Germany, France, where I now live, and all of England and Wales and Scotland. And we're one country. We honestly are one great continent. Don't let these cultists who are, just delusioned, who've hijacked Parliament, tell us these kind of heretical concepts of disunity and division. Unfortunately, the mass media encourage them, and the warlords who make vast amounts of money from wars are suppressing the knowledge of unity and love that I'm talking about. And unfortunately, when you stand up against them, you either get assassinated like Martin Luther King and Gandhi, or you get ignored like the unknown saints of history, or like Thomas of Becket was assassinated. I want to end by quoting from one witness to peace, Bert de Licht, a Dutchman, lived from 1863 to 1938. He died in Nantes in France. He was educated at the University of Utrecht. He was probably the most important peace campaigner in Dutch history. And my friend who's professor of history at the University of Bradford, Peter van den Dungen, has studied his work. He created an international peace union, the International Anti-Militarist Bureau, in 1921. He went to live in Geneva in 1925 and met with Albert Einstein, Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, Maria Montessori and Aldous Huxley, all of whom were supporting his work to create an international network for peace. And he opposed war, and he wanted a true peace liberation movement. He opposed violent revolution because he said, no, violent revolution simply changes the name of the game, but it's still violence. And he wrote a book on the conquest of violence in 1937. And he's one of the most important peace thinkers of Dutch and European history. He died in France in 1938 before the horrors of World War II unfolded. It's because of people like him that the European Union exists, is to prevent violence and war between these wonderful countries that make up Europe. And the greatest statesmen and thinkers of modern British history have known that. They've worked for peace in Europe. And You know, people like Roy Jenkins, who later became Chancellor of the University of Oxford and where I taught. You know, these were savants who were genuine academic, intellectual politicians. They would have qualified for a licence. But most of the people that are pushing Brexit, I think, should be really deprogrammed for cult, adherence, and what they're doing is scandalous and dangerous. So, and finally, I want to finish on two last little points. Firstly, I want to say at the moment I've taken an oath to my late mother, who was a Marxist, a communist, and who felt that Karl Marx's views were very relevant to our problems as a world. And so I've taken an oath to listen to the entirety of Das Kapital, which is a vast work. And I've studied it, I've read it for university, but I'm rereading the whole thing, page to page, as an audiobook. And here we have the 3 volumes of Das Kapital. Now, parts of it are unreadable. I mean, I listen to it and it's like, he's so complex about the nature of capital and what it's caused by. But his fundamental insight is very simple. Marx was a typical European intellectual partner, well, Jewish, and who descended from many rabbis, who ended up living in London because it was the haven of liberal thought, thank God, and he was trying to think through the money problem. You see, as a good Hegelian starting out, Hegel had said, look, everything in reality is a manifestation of spirit, Geist. We humans, everything, all of nature. So we're God in evolution, effectively. Well, then Marx said, okay, if that's true, then why are people in suffering? Why are people in slavery? Why are people in poverty? Why are people unemployed? You know, if everything's good, how come there's so much suffering? And he said, well, there's something going on here called capital. Some people have vast amounts of it, and others have very, very, very little. There's a disparity, and the people that have the vast amounts are misusing it to the disadvantage of the poor. Now, Thomas Piketty, who's a French economist, has argued in his book, Revisiting Capital, that this is still the case. And so I'm revisiting Marx's theories and his treatise. Now, a lot of it is out of date, but the fundamental moral fervour at its core is still valid. What he's arguing is that capital, when it's accumulated, has its own laws that it follows, which is to self-replicate. It's kind of always wanting to grow bigger. And that I think the analysis that Marx provides of capitalism is at the root another cause for what's going on in Brexit. It's not that necessarily bad people are doing bad things. It's people are wedded to a system, capitalism, which thinks in its self-interest. These are the people that run the offshore accounts. These are people like Theresa May's husband and his cronies, people like Aaron Banks who bankrolled Vote Leave. There's hundreds of these people, probably thousands, at different levels of the capitalist mechanism who operate, in Britain and in its offshore dependencies like the Channel Islands, Isle of Man, Cayman Islands and so on. And I met many of these people who think that Brexit will be good for capital. They think that the European Union is bad for capital, although I think there's no evidence that that's the case, and that yes, there have been problems with the money situation, economics in countries like Greece and to some extent Italy and Spain and so on, but there are problems that could be solved from within a broadly social democrat, liberal democrat tradition. What the Brexit lot are saying is that no, for us, we have to free capital up by getting out of that system altogether, keeping it in our offshore banks, doing deals with dodgy capital around the world. We'll have lots of new capital flooding in. Now, all this, I think, is proving to be a delusion. We're seeing vast flights of capital out of London. You see, capital ultimately follows the path